My name is Clara, and this is the story of how 4 months with my mother-in-law changed everything. I lived in a Victorian terraced house in Clapham with my husband David, who worked as an IT consultant for a firm in Canary Wharf. We had been married for 3 years, and our life together had been comfortable and predictable until Margaret arrived. David's mother had come to stay with us in late September, ostensibly for 2 weeks while she sorted out the sale of her own flat in Hampstead. She was 72, recently widowed, and claimed she needed time to decide where to settle permanently. What began as a temporary arrangement had somehow stretched into 4 months, and by January, Margaret had established herself in our spare room as though she owned the place. That particular Tuesday morning in late January, I was working at my laptop in the living room, designing a brochure for a local bakery. I worked as a freelance graphic designer, which meant I often used our dining table as my office. The clicking of my keyboard was barely audible, but Margaret, who was reading the Telegraph in her armchair, looked up with visible irritation. "Clara, dear," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of false sweetness I had come to recognize, "I'm finding it rather difficult to concentrate on my crossword with all that incessant tapping. Perhaps you could work elsewhere today?" I glanced around our living room, noting how Margaret had rearranged the furniture to suit her preferences, moved her collection of ceramic birds onto our mantelpiece, and claimed the best armchair as her own. The room no longer felt like the home David and I had created together. It felt like Margaret's sitting room, where I was merely a tolerated guest. "Of course," I replied, closing my laptop with what I hoped was a gracious smile. "I'll work upstairs." As I gathered my things, Margaret returned to her newspaper with a satisfied expression. This had become our daily ritual. Margaret would find some small fault with my presence, and I would quietly retreat to accommodate her wishes. David had stopped noticing these exchanges weeks ago, or perhaps he simply chose not to see them. Later that afternoon, when David returned from work, Margaret was ready with her carefully rehearsed complaint. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard her voice drifting from the living room. "David, darling, I do hope you don't mind me saying, but I'm finding it increasingly difficult to find any peace in this house. Your wife seems to be constantly bustling about, and frankly, her presence is rather disturbing to my equilibrium." The silence that followed was telling. I stood frozen by the cooker, a wooden spoon suspended halfway to my mouth for tasting the sauce, waiting for David to defend me, to explain that this was my home too. Instead, I heard the rustle of his newspaper and his measured response. "I'm sorry you're feeling unsettled, Mum. Perhaps we can work something out." That evening, as we sat around the dinner table, Margaret smiled at me with what I now recognized as her victory expression. She had made her position clear. I was the problem, the disruption in her peaceful existence, and David had tacitly agreed. The realization settled over me like a cold fog, and I understood that something fundamental had shifted in my marriage that day. What I didn't know was that Margaret's declaration of war was only the beginning, and that tomorrow would bring an escalation I could never have imagined. The next morning brought an escalation I should have anticipated. I woke to find David already dressed for work, moving about our bedroom with unusual haste. When I asked if everything was all right, he barely glanced in my direction. "Mum had trouble sleeping," he said, adjusting his tie with sharp, irritated movements. "She says the house feels too chaotic, that she can't find any tranquility with you constantly moving about downstairs." I sat up in bed, pulling my dressing gown around me. "David, I was working quietly at my laptop yesterday. I moved upstairs when she asked me to." "That's not the point, Clara." His voice carried an edge I rarely heard. "She's been through enough with Dad's death and selling the house. The least we can do is make her feel comfortable here." What struck me most about this conversation was not David's defense of his mother, but his use of the word "we" when he clearly meant "you." Margaret's comfort, it seemed, was my sole responsibility, whilst David could continue his routine undisturbed. After he left for work, I attempted to have a civil conversation with Margaret over breakfast. She was seated at our kitchen table, perfectly dressed despite the early hour, reading her newspaper whilst sipping tea from the bone china cup she had brought from her own home. "Margaret," I began carefully, "David mentioned you had difficulty sleeping. Is there anything I can do to help make you more comfortable?" She looked up from her paper with an expression of mild surprise, as though I had said something rather inappropriate. Well, Clara, since you ask, I do find the constant activity in this house rather overwhelming. In my own home, I was accustomed to a certain level of peace and quiet. I understand, I replied, though I was beginning to question whether understanding was what Margaret actually wanted. Perhaps we could work out some sort of schedule, so you know when I'll be working and when the house will be quieter. Margaret's smile was thin and cold. Oh, my dear, I don't think you quite grasp the situation. It's not about schedules, you see. It's about the general atmosphere of the house. Some people have a naturally calming presence, whilst others seem to bring a certain energy that can be quite disruptive. The implication was unmistakable. I was the disruptive energy, the chaos that prevented her from finding peace in what she increasingly referred to as David's home rather than our home. That afternoon, when David returned from work looking thoroughly exhausted, Margaret was ready with her next move. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard her voice from the living room, pitched perfectly to Carrie. David, darling, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning. Perhaps it would be best if Clara had somewhere else to spend her days whilst she works. I know she means well, but her constant presence is really quite overwhelming for someone of my age and sensitivity. I stood frozen by the cooker, a wooden spoon gripping tightly in my hand, listening to my husband's response. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before David finally spoke. What do you suggest, Mum? Well, Margaret continued, her voice bright with false helpfulness, she could work at a cafe, couldn't she? Or perhaps the library. Somewhere she'd have proper space and wouldn't feel she was disturbing anyone. What happened next still astounds me when I think back on it. David called my name, summoning me to the living room like a child called before the headmaster. When I appeared in the doorway, he looked distinctly uncomfortable, but his resolve seemed fixed. Clara, Mum and I have been discussing the working situation. Perhaps it would be better if you found somewhere else to work during the day. Give Mum some space to relax properly. I stared at my husband, this man I had loved and married, who was now asking me to leave my own home so his mother could be more comfortable. Margaret sat in her claimed armchair, watching this exchange with obvious satisfaction. This is my home too, David, I said quietly. Of course it is, he replied, though his words lacked conviction. But Mum won't be here forever, and she needs our support right now. What I didn't say in that moment was that Margaret had been staying with us for 4 months without any concrete plans to leave, and that her need for support seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker with each passing week. What I didn't realize was that tomorrow would bring an even more shocking demonstration of just how far David was willing to go to preserve his mother's peace of mind. The following day began like any other, except for the knot of tension that had settled permanently in my stomach since David's ultimatum. I had spent a sleepless night contemplating my husband's request that I effectively exile myself from my own home during daylight hours. When morning came, I made a decision that would prove more significant than I could have imagined. I chose to stay. David left for work without his usual goodbye kiss, his disapproval evident in the stiff set of his shoulders. Margaret emerged from her room precisely at 9 o'clock, as she did every morning, dressed immaculately in her pearl grey jumper and perfectly pressed trousers. She surveyed the kitchen where I sat with my laptop and a cup of tea, her expression registering something between disappointment and irritation. "Oh," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of manufactured surprise. "I rather thought you'd taken David's suggestion to heart and found alternative arrangements for your work." "This is my home, Margaret," I replied, keeping my voice level and polite. "I have every right to work here." What followed was a masterclass in passive aggression that would have impressed even the most skilled practitioners of emotional warfare. Margaret began by sighing heavily every few minutes, the sound designed to communicate her profound suffering at my continued presence. When that failed to drive me away, she escalated to more direct methods. "Clara, dear," she said after an hour of theatrical sighs, "I'm finding it impossible to concentrate on my reading with all that clicking and typing. Perhaps you could work somewhere else in the house." I closed my laptop and moved to the living room, settling myself at the dining table. Margaret followed within minutes, claiming she needed to dust the ornaments she had placed around the room. Her dusting was enthusiastic and pointedly thorough, accompanied by much moving of furniture and muttering about how difficult it was to maintain proper standards when the house was constantly in use. When I moved to the conservatory, Margaret decided she needed to water the plants. When I retreated to the hallway, she discovered an urgent need to reorganize the coat cupboard. It became clear that my physical presence anywhere in the house was an affront to Margaret's sensibilities, and she was prepared to pursue me from room to room until I surrendered. At 11:30, Margaret made her most audacious move yet. She picked up the telephone and called David at his office. "David, darling," I heard her say, her voice trembling with carefully constructed distress, "I'm terribly sorry to disturb you at work, but I'm at my wit's end here. Clara has refused to make alternative working arrangements, and I simply cannot find a moment's peace anywhere in the house. I'm feeling quite overwhelmed, and my blood pressure tablets aren't helping. I wonder if you might speak to her." Within 20 minutes, David's car pulled into our drive. I watched from the conservatory window as he marched up the front path with the determined stride of a man who had made an unpleasant but necessary decision. When he entered the house, his face was set in grim lines. "Clara," he called, his voice carrying an authority I had never heard before. "Could I have a word?" What happened next was the moment that changed everything between us, though I didn't fully comprehend its significance at the time. David appeared in the conservatory doorway, his expression a mixture of exasperation and determination. "This has to stop," he said firmly. "Mum is genuinely distressed, and I won't have her upset in her own home." "Her own home?" I repeated, standing slowly from my chair. "You know what I mean," David replied, though his slight flush suggested he was aware of the implications of his words. "She needs peace and quiet, and you're making that impossible. I want you to go to your room and stay there until I've taken Mum out for lunch. Give her some proper space to breathe." I stared at my husband, this man who was speaking to me as though I were a misbehaving child rather than his wife and equal partner. Behind him, I could see Margaret hovering in the hallway, her expression one of concerned innocence. "Go to my room?" I asked incredulously. "Just until we get back," David said, his voice softening slightly as though he recognized the absurdity of his request. "Please, Clara. Do this for me." What followed was the most humiliating moment of my marriage. David escorted me upstairs to our bedroom as though I were being sent to bed without supper. When I reached the door, I heard the unmistakable sound of the key turning in the lock from the outside. My husband had locked me in our bedroom like a prisoner in my own home. As I listened to their voices below, followed by the sound of the front door closing and David's car starting, I realized that something fundamental had broken between us. What I didn't know was that the 3 hours I would spend alone in that room would transform me in ways that neither David nor Margaret could have anticipated. The key turned in the lock, and I heard David's footsteps retreating down the stairs. For the first few minutes, I stood motionless in the center of our bedroom, struggling to comprehend what had just occurred. My husband had actually locked me away like some sort of inconvenient problem that needed to be contained whilst he tended to his mother's comfort. I sat heavily on the edge of our bed, staring at the door that had become my prison. The humiliation was complete and devastating. In the space of 3 days, I had gone from being an equal partner in our marriage to being treated like a troublesome child who needed to be managed and controlled. But as the initial shock began to fade, something unexpected happened. Instead of dissolving into tears or self-pity, I felt a strange sense of clarity descending upon me. For the first time in 4 months, I was completely alone with my thoughts, free from Margaret's constant presence and David's increasingly defensive behavior. I walked to our bedroom window and looked out at the street below. It was a perfectly ordinary Wednesday afternoon in Clapham. People were going about their normal lives whilst I remained trapped in my own home. The absurdity of the situation struck me with sudden force, and I found myself laughing despite everything. That laughter marked the beginning of my transformation. I began to examine our bedroom with fresh eyes, seeing it not as a prison but as a sanctuary where I could finally think clearly. On David's bedside table, I noticed a small pile of paperwork he had left scattered about. Curiosity prompted me to glance through it, and what I discovered made my blood run cold. Hidden beneath his work documents were several handwritten letters, all addressed to David in Margaret's distinctive script. I hesitated for only a moment before reading them. What I found was a systematic campaign of manipulation that had been ongoing for months, predating her arrival at our house. The letters revealed Margaret's true feelings about our marriage with startling clarity. She wrote about her concerns that David had changed since marrying me, that he was becoming distant from his family, that I was isolating him from the people who truly cared about him. Most damning of all was her repeated assertion that David had been happier and more successful before our marriage. One letter, dated just 2 weeks after Margaret's arrival, was particularly revealing. She wrote about how she could see the strain our marriage was causing David, how he seemed tired and worn down by domestic responsibilities. She suggested that perhaps some time apart might help him gain perspective on what truly mattered in life. As I read these letters, I realized that Margaret's extended stay was not the result of circumstance or need. It was a calculated strategy designed to disrupt our marriage and drive a wedge between David and me. Her constant complaints about my presence, her demands for peace and quiet, her theatrical displays of distress, all of it was orchestrated to make me appear unreasonable and troublesome. But the most shocking discovery was David's responses to some of these letters. I found copies of his replies hidden in the same drawer, and his words revealed a side of my husband I had never seen. He wrote about feeling overwhelmed by marriage, about missing the simplicity of his bachelor life, about wondering whether he had made the right choice in settling down so young. Reading those letters was like discovering that the man I had married was a stranger. The David I thought I knew would never have discussed our private marriage with his mother in such terms. He would never have allowed her to poison his mind against me so systematically. As I sat on our bed, surrounded by evidence of their conspiracy, I felt the last vestiges of my old self slipping away. The accommodating, people-pleasing Clara who had spent 4 months trying to make peace with an impossible situation was disappearing. In her place, something stronger and more determined was emerging. I carefully returned the letters to their hiding place and began to consider my options. I could confront David about what I had discovered, but I suspected he would simply deny everything or find ways to justify their correspondence. I could pack my bags and leave, but that would be exactly what Margaret wanted. Or I could stay and fight for my marriage on my own terms. By the time I heard David's car returning to our drive 3 hours later, I had made my decision. The woman he would find waiting for him would not be the same one he had locked away that afternoon. The sound of the key turning in our bedroom door marked not my release from prison, but the beginning of my campaign to reclaim my home and my marriage. What David and Margaret discovered when they returned from their celebratory lunch was that they had made a critical error in leaving me alone with my thoughts and their secrets. When David unlocked our bedroom door that evening, he wore the sheepish expression of a man who knew he had overstepped but hoped to avoid discussing it. Behind him, Margaret hovered with barely concealed anticipation, clearly expecting to find me defeated and chastened by my afternoon of confinement. Instead, they found me sitting calmly at my dressing table, applying lipstick with steady hands. I had changed into my favorite dress, the navy blue one that David had always said brought out my eyes, and arranged my hair in a style I hadn't worn since our honeymoon. I looked, for the first time in months, like myself again. "Clara," David began uncertainly, "I hope you understand that what happened today was necessary." Mum was genuinely distressed, and "I understand perfectly," I interrupted, my voice carrying a composure that seemed to surprise them both. "You felt that locking your wife in her bedroom was an appropriate solution to your mother's discomfort. How was your lunch?" The casual tone of my question clearly unsettled David. He had expected tears, arguments, or wounded silence. Instead, I was behaving as though nothing remarkable had occurred, which was somehow more disturbing to him than any emotional outburst would have been. "It was fine," he replied cautiously. "We went to that little bistro near the common. Mum enjoyed herself." "How lovely," I said, turning from the mirror to face them both. "I'm so glad Margaret was able to find the peace she needed. I trust the house was sufficiently quiet for her during my absence." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. She sensed something different in my manner, a subtle shift that she couldn't quite identify but instinctively distrusted. "Yes, dear, it was much more tranquil. Perhaps we've found a solution that works for everyone." "Perhaps we have," I agreed pleasantly. "Though I should mention that I've made some decisions about my own arrangements whilst I was reflecting this afternoon." David's relief was palpable. That's wonderful, Clara. I knew you'd see reason. What sort of arrangements? I stood up and smoothed my dress, taking my time before responding. The anticipation in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Margaret leaned forward slightly, clearly expecting me to announce my surrender, perhaps my decision to work elsewhere or even to visit my sister for an extended period. Well, I said thoughtfully, I've decided that if peace and tranquility are so important in this house, then we should all commit to maintaining them properly. Starting tomorrow morning, I'll be implementing some new household guidelines to ensure everyone's comfort. The confusion on their faces was almost comical. This was not the conversation they had anticipated having. What sort of guidelines? David asked warily. Oh, nothing too dramatic, I replied airily. Just some basic considerations for shared living. For instance, I think we should establish quiet hours when no one speaks above a whisper. Margaret's sensitivity to noise is clearly quite severe, so we should probably observe silence from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening. Margaret's mouth fell open slightly. But Clara, dear, that's rather extreme. Is it? I asked innocently. You've made it quite clear that any sound I make is disturbing to you. Surely if we're all committed to your comfort, we should extend that courtesy consistently. I moved to our wardrobe and began selecting clothes for the following day, continuing my explanation as though I were discussing the weather. I've also been thinking about the furniture arrangements. Since Margaret has such specific requirements for her environment, perhaps she should have complete control over the living spaces. David and I can simply adapt to whatever configuration she prefers on any given day. Now, Clara, David interjected, clearly sensing that this conversation was heading in an unexpected direction, let's not get carried away. We just need to find a reasonable compromise. But I thought we had found one, I said, turning to face him with a bright smile. You've made it clear that Margaret's needs take precedence over mine in this house. I'm simply suggesting we apply that principle consistently rather than arbitrarily. The silence that followed was profound. Margaret was beginning to realize that her victory might have been somewhat Pyrrhic, whilst David was grappling with the implications of having his own logic applied more broadly than he had intended. I think perhaps we should discuss this more calmly tomorrow, David suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Of course, I agreed pleasantly. Though I should warn you that I've developed quite a lot of ideas during my time for reflection today. It's amazing how clearly one can think when given proper space and solitude. As I spoke these words, I watched Margaret's face carefully. Something in my tone seemed to alert her to the possibility that my afternoon of confinement had not produced the results she had anticipated. What she didn't yet realize was that her strategy had backfired spectacularly, and that the real battle for this house was only just beginning. The next morning, I implemented my new household guidelines with cheerful determination. I woke at 7 o'clock, dressed quietly, and went downstairs to prepare breakfast in complete silence. When Margaret appeared at her usual 9 o'clock, immaculately dressed and expecting her morning routine, she found me sitting at the kitchen table reading a book, with a finger pressed to my lips. "Good morning, Margaret," I whispered. "Remember, we're observing quiet hours from 8 until 6. I do hope you slept well." The confusion on her face was delicious. She opened her mouth to respond normally, then caught herself, glancing uncertainly between me and the clock on the wall. I had effectively trapped her in her own web of sensitivity to noise and disruption. For the next hour, Margaret attempted to go about her morning routine whilst communicating only in whispers. Her frustration grew visibly as she struggled to maintain her carefully constructed image of delicate sensibility whilst simultaneously wanting to protest the absurdity of the situation. By 10 o'clock, she had clearly reached her breaking point. "Clara," she hissed, "this is ridiculous. I never asked for complete silence." I looked up from my book with an expression of innocent concern. "Oh, but Margaret, you've been so clear about your need for tranquility. I thought this would be perfect for you. Isn't it peaceful?" When David called from work during his morning break, Margaret was ready with her carefully prepared complaint. I could hear her voice from the living room as she described my unreasonable behavior and deliberate attempts to make everyone uncomfortable. What she didn't realize was that I was recording the conversation on my mobile phone. That afternoon, whilst Margaret was having her customary nap, I made a discovery that changed everything. Searching through the post that had been accumulating on the hall table, I found 3 letters addressed to me that I had never seen. They had been opened and hastily resealed, clearly by Margaret. The first was from a design agency in Soho, offering me a lucrative contract that would have doubled my current income. The second was from my sister Emma, asking why I hadn't responded to her invitation to visit her family in Edinburgh. The third was from our mortgage company, confirming that they had processed my request to add a home office extension to our property. I had never made such a request. With growing horror, I realized that Margaret had not only been intercepting my post but had also been impersonating me in correspondence with our mortgage company. The extension request had been approved and work was scheduled to begin in 3 weeks. The cost would add £15,000 to our mortgage. This was no longer about domestic discomfort or personality clashes. Margaret was actively sabotaging my career and manipulating our finances. I photographed all 3 letters and the mortgage documents with my phone, creating a record of her deception. When David returned from work that evening, he found me in the kitchen preparing dinner with unusual enthusiasm. Margaret was lurking nearby, clearly having spent the day planning her next strategy. "How was work, darling?" I asked brightly, kissing David's cheek as he loosened his tie. "Fine," he replied cautiously. "Mum mentioned you had some sort of disagreement about noise levels." "Oh, that," I laughed. I was just trying to be considerate of Margaret's needs. But I've actually had the most interesting day. I discovered some fascinating correspondence that I think you should see. I placed the 3 letters on the kitchen table with deliberate care. David's face went pale as he recognized the official mortgage company letterhead. "What's this about a home office extension?" he asked slowly. "That's exactly what I was wondering," I replied pleasantly. "Since I never applied for one." The silence in the kitchen was deafening. Margaret had gone very still, her usual theatrical expressions replaced by something approaching panic. "There must be some mistake," David said weakly. "Oh, I'm sure there is," I agreed. "The question is, who made it?" For the first time since her arrival, Margaret had no ready answer, no carefully prepared excuse or emotional manipulation to deflect attention from her actions. She had been caught in an act of deception so serious that even David couldn't ignore or excuse it. What happened next would determine whether my marriage could survive the revelation of just how far Margaret was willing to go to destroy it. The morning after my discovery of Margaret's financial deception, I woke with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in months. I dressed carefully, choosing my most professional outfit, and went downstairs to find Margaret already seated at the kitchen table with her newspaper and morning tea. "Good morning, Margaret," I said pleasantly, placing the 3 intercepted letters beside her teacup. "I thought we should discuss these." Margaret glanced at the letters with studied indifference, but I noticed the slight tremor in her hand as she reached for her tea. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, dear." "The job offer you hid from me," I said, sitting across from her. "The letter from my sister that you opened. And most importantly, the mortgage extension you applied for in my name. That's fraud, Margaret." For a moment, her carefully constructed mask slipped, and I saw something cold and calculating in her eyes. Then she recovered, arranging her features into an expression of wounded innocence. "Clara, I think you're being rather dramatic. I may have accidentally opened some post, but surely that's hardly criminal." "Accidentally?" I pulled out my phone and showed her the photographs I had taken. "You forged my signature on bank documents, Margaret. You've added £15,000 to our mortgage without my knowledge or consent." The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Margaret's composure was cracking, and for the first time since her arrival, she looked genuinely uncertain. "You don't understand," she said finally, her voice losing its usual honeyed tone. "David was struggling financially before you married him. I was only trying to help by securing funds for home improvements that would increase the property value. By committing fraud in my name? By being practical." Margaret snapped, her facade finally beginning to crumble. "You have no idea what David's life was like before you came along. He was content, successful, unburdened by domestic responsibilities. Since your marriage, He's been under constant stress, trying to maintain a lifestyle he can't afford. I stared at her, finally seeing the woman behind the performance. So you decided to sabotage our marriage by making me appear incompetent and disruptive whilst simultaneously manipulating our finances? I decided to protect my son from a mistake that was ruining his life. Her voice was rising now, all pretense of gentility abandoned. David deserves better than this suburban mediocrity. Before you, he had prospects, ambitions. Now he's trapped in a mortgage he can barely afford with a wife who contributes nothing meaningful to his success. The venom in her words was shocking, but also liberating. Finally, Margaret was showing her true feelings instead of hiding behind passive-aggressive comments and theatrical displays of sensitivity. David chose to marry me, I said calmly. He chose this house, this life, this future. You can't accept that he's happy with his decisions. Happy? Margaret laughed bitterly. You think he's happy playing house with you? He calls me every week, Clara, complaining about the financial pressure, the domestic obligations, the constant demands on his time and energy. He's miserable, but he's too polite to tell you. Then why don't we ask him? I suggested, hearing David's car in the driveway. Margaret's face went pale. She had become so absorbed in our confrontation that she hadn't noticed the time. David was home early from work, and he would walk into a conversation that would finally expose everything. Clara, Margaret said urgently, her voice returning to its familiar pleading tone, there's no need to involve David in this misunderstanding. Surely we can resolve this between ourselves like civilized adults. No, Margaret, I replied firmly. We can't. Because this isn't a misunderstanding. It's a deliberate campaign to destroy my marriage, and it ends today. The front door opened, and David called out his usual greeting. Margaret and I sat frozen, facing each other across the kitchen table like opponents in a chess match where all the pieces had finally been revealed. What David discovered when he entered that kitchen would force him to choose between the woman who had given birth to him and the woman he had promised to love and honor. The moment of truth had finally arrived. David appeared in the kitchen doorway, loosening his tie with the weary expression of a man who had endured a difficult day at work. The scene that greeted him brought him to an abrupt halt, his wife and mother sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, surrounded by official documents, their faces flushed with obvious tension. What's going on? He asked cautiously, sensing the charged atmosphere in the room. Your mother has something to explain to you, I said calmly, gesturing to the letters spread across the table. About the mortgage extension she applied for in my name. David's eyes moved from the documents to Margaret's face, which had gone deathly pale. Mum. David, darling, Margaret began, her voice trembling with carefully constructed vulnerability. Clara is making some rather serious accusations based on what appears to be a simple misunderstanding. It's not a misunderstanding, I interrupted firmly. Your mother has been intercepting my post for months. She hid a job offer that would have doubled my income, prevented me from responding to my sister's invitation, and forged my signature on mortgage documents. She's committed fraud, David. The color drained from David's face as he picked up the mortgage papers with shaking hands. Mum, is this true? For a moment, Margaret seemed to consider continuing her denial. Then something shifted in her expression, and I saw her make a calculated decision to abandon her victim act in favor of righteous indignation. Yes, I did it, she said, her voice gaining strength and conviction. And I'd do it again. Someone needed to protect you from the financial ruin this marriage is causing. David stared at his mother as though seeing her for the first time. You forged Clara's signature on legal documents. I protected your interests when you were too besotted to see clearly, Margaret shot back, her genteel facade cracking completely. Do you have any idea what you've thrown away for this suburban fantasy? You were destined for greatness, David. You had ambition, prospects, a future that extended beyond mortgage payments and domestic mediocrity. That's enough, David said quietly, but Margaret was beyond stopping now. Is it? Look at yourself, David. 3 years ago, you were being headhunted by firms in the city. You had savings, investments, a life of your own. Now you're trapped in debt, chained to responsibilities that drain your potential every single day. I watched my husband's face as his mother systematically demolished everything we had built together. This was Margaret's final gambit. If she couldn't manipulate the situation subtly, she would destroy it completely. "You think I'm trapped?" David asked slowly. "I know you are. You call me every week, complaining about the financial pressure, the constant demands on your time and energy. You've told me yourself that marriage isn't what you expected it to be." The silence that followed was devastating. I felt something cold settle in my chest as I realized that Margaret wasn't entirely fabricating these conversations. David had been discussing our marriage with his mother, sharing his private doubts and frustrations with the one person guaranteed to use them as weapons against me. "David," I said quietly, "is that true?" He couldn't meet my eyes. "Clara, it's not how it sounds. Everyone has moments of doubt." "Moments?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "David, you told me just last month that you felt like you were living someone else's life. You said you missed the freedom to make spontaneous decisions without consulting a wife about domestic budgets and social obligations." Each word was a carefully aimed arrow, designed to inflict maximum damage on our marriage. But as I watched Margaret deliver her devastating revelations, I realized she had made a critical error. In her desperation to poison David against me, she was revealing the depth of her own manipulation and betrayal. "So you decided to sabotage our finances to prove your point?" I asked coolly. "I decided to create a crisis that would force David to see the truth about what this marriage is costing him," Margaret replied defiantly. "Sometimes people need a shock to wake them up to reality." David was staring at his mother with horror. "You deliberately tried to destroy our marriage?" "I tried to save you from destroying your life," Margaret snapped. "And if you had any sense, you'd thank me for it instead of standing there looking at me like I'm some sort of criminal." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of our wall clock. Margaret sat rigidly upright, her mask of gentility completely abandoned, revealing the calculating woman who had orchestrated months of psychological warfare. David stood frozen between us, finally seeing the true scope of his mother's betrayal. What happened next would determine whether our marriage could survive not only Margaret's manipulation, but also the revelation of David's own complicity in undermining what we had built together. The silence stretched for what felt like hours before David finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Get out." Margaret's triumphant expression faltered. "What did you say?" I said get out. David's voice was stronger now, carrying a conviction I hadn't heard in months. "Pack your things and leave my house. Today." "David, you can't possibly. You forged legal documents in my wife's name," he said, his words cutting through Margaret's protests like ice. "You sabotaged her career, manipulated our finances, and spent months systematically trying to destroy our marriage. You're not welcome here anymore." Margaret's face cycled through shock, indignation, and finally desperate manipulation. "David, darling, you're upset. You're not thinking clearly. I'm your mother." "You're a stranger," David replied flatly. "The mother I thought I knew would never have done what you've done." For the first time since her arrival, Margaret seemed genuinely panicked. Her carefully constructed world was collapsing, and she had no strategy left except raw desperation. "You're choosing her over your own family," she demanded, her voice rising to a pitch I'd never heard before. "I'm choosing my wife over someone who committed fraud and tried to destroy my marriage," David said calmly. "There's a difference." Margaret turned to me with unconcealed hatred. "You've won, then. Congratulations. You've turned my son against his own mother." "No, Margaret," I replied steadily. "You did that yourself." What happened next surprised everyone, including myself. Instead of the tears or angry words I expected, Margaret began to laugh, a bitter, brittle sound that filled the kitchen with its ugliness. "You think this is over?" she asked, looking between David and me. "You think you can simply dismiss me and live happily ever after in your little suburban paradise?" "Actually, yes," I said calmly. "That's exactly what we're going to do." Margaret's laughter stopped abruptly. She stared at me for a long moment, perhaps finally recognizing that the accommodating woman she had been trying to break no longer existed. "You have 1 hour to pack," David said quietly. "I'll drive you to your flat in Hampstead. After that, Any communication between us goes through solicitors. David. 1 hour, Mum. Margaret stood slowly, her movements suddenly those of an elderly woman rather than the commanding presence she had been moments before. Her defeat was complete and undeniable. She walked to the kitchen door, then turned back one final time. "You'll regret this," she said, but the words lacked conviction. "The only thing I regret," David replied, "is that it took me so long to see what you were doing." After Margaret left the kitchen, David and I stood facing each other across the table where this final confrontation had played out. The silence between us was different now, not uncomfortable, but expectant, as though we were both waiting to see who we would be without Margaret's poisonous influence. "I'm sorry," David said finally. "For all of it. For not defending you, for letting her manipulate me, for discussing our marriage with someone who was using my words as weapons against you." I studied my husband's face, seeing genuine remorse alongside something else, relief, perhaps, at finally being free from his mother's emotional blackmail. "The question now," I said quietly, "is whether we can rebuild what she tried to destroy." David reached across the table and took my hand. "I'd like to try. If you're willing to give me that chance." An hour later, we stood in our doorway watching David's car disappear down the street, carrying Margaret back to her own flat where she belonged. The house felt different immediately, lighter somehow, as though a oppressive weight had been lifted from its very foundations. That evening, as we sat together in our reclaimed living room, I realized that Margaret's campaign of destruction had achieved something she never intended. In trying to break our marriage, she had forced us both to fight for it, to decide what we truly valued and what we were willing to sacrifice to protect it. The woman who had stood paralyzed at our door months ago was gone forever, replaced by someone stronger, more certain of her worth and her place in the world. And the man beside me had finally learned to choose love over fear.